lot of Broadway students, I'm sure, that are doing activities.
And 12 of the major agencies still have active, and have for years, it's been active DOD. The person pushing out is one of the finest, most well-respected person in the whole community. He's been in justice for like 10 years, and he's fantastic. Yeah, but because he was nominated by Obama, he'll never get,
So it is Senate confirmed.
he will never get Senate confirmed. Okay, there's two different categories. There's the presidentially appointed, which needs Senate confirmation, CISs, and then the DFEs, designated federal entities, those are agencies that don't like the Smithsonian. And that's a greater number that don't need Senate confirmation. And those can go through so he gets, help with being sort of a job placement kind of thing. You can send your resume there, I'd like to move up, I've been assistant IT energy, whatever. And so they help particularly with but presidential appointed, it depends. Like for
All right, I think we're good. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much for your time.
Hello.
They like judges that stay in the job for as long as they want it,
yes.
or
And it's funny that you mentioned that because so in dealing with the performance issue, one of my thoughts was you had two five-year terms and you could be renewed once. But I talked to one of the actually perform the interview. University and the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. I welcome you. We have a wonderful partnership with REI to offer these great breakfasts. There have been so many wonderful sessions with great exchange among and within the grants community, both in here and also online. Many people watch this, and we welcome you too to be down watching this at your computers, at your offices. The Trachtenberg School is a graduate school with 3 master's degrees and a PhD in the public policy and public administration arena. We are very full with fantastic scholars that affect public policy on an ongoing basis, and students who are amazing and go on to wonderful careers in public service broadly construed. And because there are many different ways that they are able to make a difference, which is why they come to us. So it's my pleasure to be here and learn from our NASA speaker today. I love to learn every time I come to these. So thank you very much for joining us at GW, either in person or online. And now I'm going to introduce my partner in crime from REI, Jeff.
Thanks, Kathy. I am Jeff Myers, Senior Director at REI Systems, and I want to tell you the reason that we wanted to host these events and are so pleased that George Washington University agreed to do so with us is to try and promote a sense of community within grants management or the grants management arena. Essentially to give folks kind of a number of other members of the community who've been through some similar challenge before and they have some ideas how to approach it, and who will be able to kind of give a point of reference in the future to be able to kind of think about both career development, development of the profession, and frankly be able to take better care of not only resources but achieve better mission outcomes for the federal government with the money it spends on grants, which is over $700 billion a year. REI Systems itself provides both consulting as well as system support for grant managers, primarily grant makers, but grant recipients as well. I'm pleased to announce that actually we've started doing this beyond the federal and the state and local communities where we have worked heavily in the past. We've recently begun serving our first 2 nonprofit and foundation organizations that are also grant makers as well. One of the ways that we try to structure these sessions is by identifying topics and challenges that we think are either already present or going to be present soon in the future for grant makers, and identify someone who's really been leading in the field in that kind of new and interesting area. We do try to make sure that the grant makers who come and speak to you have direct experience and that they come from a variety of different agencies and types of backgrounds even within the grants management arena. So I'm really pleased that today Jennifer Gustetic has joined us from National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And the reason why is because she's taking kind of a user-centric view and has actually helped go through that process of reorganizing and kind of refocusing the programs that she oversees within NASA to take the perspective of how can we attract a better and a more innovative form of grant recipient. And so instead of kind of the traditional focus, which is quite important and continues for almost every agency that makes grants, of make sure the money is used well and that there's no fraud and that we get the money out the door quickly, she's helped and made significant progress in making sure that we attract grant recipients who might not know about the availability of grants and may be able to do some innovations that really frankly form the foundation of kind of American competitiveness. Many of America's best innovations come from small businesses and entrepreneurs, and it should come as no surprise to most of you that a lot of those innovations come from entrepreneurs that get some sort of grant funding or federal encouragement programs and technical support on occasion to help them succeed, and again, to really strengthen American competitiveness. So I'm very pleased that Jennifer has agreed to join us, and she is fresh off serving as a fellow at Harvard University, so she's bringing a little bit of a perspective from kind of academia as well as, of course, government, and has grants expertise that I think many of you will find really helpful to learn and to understand about. Just as a heads up, Jen has agreed that she will be happy to have questions from the audience throughout the course of her presentation as well as at the end. And those questions are certainly welcome, of course, from folks who are in the room as well as folks who are viewing online over the live stream. So thank you very much for joining us, Jen. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you guys for having me. Hi, Heather. Hi,
Thanks, Sarah. It's good to see familiar faces from our REI team that's been supporting us on NASA's SBIR program. So I'm Jen Gestetic. I am the program executive for the Small Business Innovation Research Program at NASA. I've been doing this job now for about 3.5 years. I can't believe it's been 3.5 years already. Oh, we recently published a paper in the New Space Journal. So we submitted a conference paper last year, and it's about 15 co-authors that are on that paper from our team across the REI team. Surya is one of the co-authors, as well as members of the civil service team. And we went through the process last year of actually getting that peer reviewed and published in the New Space Journal. So everything that I'm going to talk about today actually can be referenced and seen in more detail in that 26-page paper. A little bit about me. I've been running the SBIR program for the last 3.5 years, but I've been throughout my entire career focused on innovation in government more broadly. I started off working on a grants program at the Transportation Security Administration, where we were awarding both through competitive grants as well as cooperative agreements to address regional security issues with mostly transit type grants. I had nothing to do with aviation. It was all actual ground transportation security while I was at the TSA. But that was actually my first job in government. So grants, 15 years ago I started in grants, but I've moved away from grants since then actually. I've worked on prize competitions and crowdsourcing and citizen science as mechanisms for actually engaging innovators outside of the government and bringing new ideas into the way that we solve problems. I did that both at NASA and also at White House OSTP for 2 years. At the federal level, kind of driving those practices from a policy perspective. And since then, I've been working on a different mechanism for engaging innovators across the country and solving NASA's problems, SBIR and STTR, which some of you may know that SBIR and STTR can be awarded through many mechanisms actually. So ARPA-E, for example, their awards are cooperative agreements. At NIH, at NSF, it's grants. At NASA, we actually award through contracts. And we also have the authority to award through OTAs, which are that crazy thing that's being talked about all around DoD right now, and also through prizes, actually. There's a number of different ways you can actually make these awards. You don't have to make the awards only through grants or only through contracts. But having worked across a number of different ways in which the government transfers money to organizations or individuals over my career, the government tends to default to contracts or grants because that's what they know. It's their happy place because they know the rules. There's like a FAR, there's a OMB circular that says how you have to do it. So there's rules that you can follow that keep you safe, right, about how to do it, even if it might not be the ideal tool to actually necessarily address that problem. So with prizes, we've made a lot of progress in formalizing those as approaches and tools. OTAs are getting more formalized, but I just say that as context walking into this presentation about the way that I think about funding vehicles. That funding vehicles exist to serve a purpose to connect a problem seeker and a problem solver, and that problem solver may be an individual member of the public or an organization, and that organization could be a university, it could be a company, it could be a small business, it could be a variety of different types of people that transfer happens between. And in my view, the role of the government is to make that as frictionless as possible in order to actually address the problems and the mission that we're trying to solve. So this is largely derived from a conference presentation that we gave last year about the initial findings from the paper. And like I said, this paper can be found, I think it was in the August publication of the New Space Journal, same title. So for the purpose of today, I'm going to walk through really quickly to just do a little bit more of an overview of the SBIR program, talk about the challenge that we were faced with as a program that we were trying to address, and some of the lessons learned through what we actually tried to or attempted to accomplish between 2016 and 2018. So how many folks in the room are like deeply familiar with SBIR? I know my team is very familiar. Are there folks that are not very familiar with SBIR's program? Okay, so I'm gonna give the high level of what SBIR is. So the Small Business Innovative Research Program and the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, which is what STTR is, were established in 1982 and 1992, respectively. So SBIR is 37 years old. That is unique for a federal program to be around for that long. It has enjoyed great support from the Hill for a very long time. And I'll tell you a little bit of a history lesson before we move on to the next point. NSF was the first one actually to pilot a SBIR program. There was a hypothesis that if a set aside amount of money was put aside to actually allow small businesses to work on research and development, that would be good for the country, because a lot of innovation comes from small businesses and entrepreneurs. And small businesses and entrepreneurs at that time had a difficult time competing against the big prime contractors and big universities. If you're like a 2-man or 2-woman shop working out of your garage on a particular idea, it's harder to compete against GW in winning an award, right? So they started off with a pilot at NSF to see, would there even be companies that would apply? What would the impact of this look like? And I believe their initial pilot was about 5 years before they expanded it to the rest of the federal government. And the requirement for this program is that any agency that spends over $1 billion in extramural R&D, so R&D is research and development, extramural is outside of your agency, so intramural is inside your agency. Like if you're funding centers, like NASA has a lot of intramural R&D where we fund our own people to do research and development at the NASA centers. But SBIR was established as a percentage of the total extramural R&D spend of an agency that spends more than $1 billion a year on R&D. Why that's important and interesting to me from a couple reasons is, one, it truly was a small business set aside and the overall agency top line budget, right? So if you're spending this much on R&D, this much should go to small businesses and entrepreneurs. 2, this is a very unique legislative hack. Like, I am only aware of one other time where Congress, where an authorizing committee has been able to get appropriations without appropriating. The authorizing committee said a percentage of appropriations has to be spent this way. That's really rare, actually, and it's because it's something that, as Jeff mentioned, from a national competitiveness standpoint, this was important. And the R&D agencies of the government should also be helping to spur entrepreneurship. So it actually got through and has continued to maintain supported since 1982. In 1992, they were seeking to increase the percentage, and that became a political battle actually with the universities, because when you think about, if you've got a bucket of extramural R&D money, who's going to get that money? Universities, big companies, and small companies. And if it's one pie, if you make one slice of the pie bigger, you make the other 2 slices of the pie slightly smaller. And so when there was a discussion about an increase in the percentage to small businesses, of course those other 2 communities were like, we don't like that idea because we want to maintain our slice of the pie. So what did STTR do? STTR added a program that required university partnership. So when the SBIR allocation was increased in 1982, or 1992, there was a new program added called STTR that required about 50% participation by universities in those awards. So it was a way to also encourage technology transfer from universities to small businesses. I just think that history lesson is kind of interesting to see like how the sausage gets made and why programs actually exist for a variety of reasons. But it's maintained its support largely because of these coalitions of different communities, stakeholder communities that it's supporting. We at NASA now fund about $200 million a year this way, again, through contracts through SBIR and STTR, but all the agencies at the top of the slide also offer SBIR and or STTR. You only have to offer STTR if you make slightly more of an R&D spend, because it's a smaller percentage and otherwise it would be a tiny program. We are one of the big 5 agencies. NSF, NASA, DOE spend roughly the same amount. DoD spends over $1 billion a year through SBIR and STTR, and HHS spends just about $1 billion, NIH. So it's a lot of money, like over $3 billion annually is spent through this funding mechanism for the government at 11 different agencies. And us alone at NASA have spent over $3 billion over the course of that 37 years. So it's a lot of money, a lot of companies. Yeah.
Jen, I always thought that grants were for things where you didn't have an expectation of an immediate measurable outcome, and maybe it's long-term or maybe it's more basic scientific research. And contracts were for things where you had kind of a shorter-term expectation, a tangible outcome that you could really kind of wanted to hold an entity responsible for. It doesn't seem to me as if that kind of general hypothesis I have is really what's playing out. You've described all of what you're doing as contracts. Why is that?
At NASA. So that's one of the big questions, that is one of the big education points whenever we're reaching out to companies about participating in the program, is what's the difference between a contracting agency and a granting agency. And now it's even more complicated because there are agencies that also do OTAs and agencies that do cooperative agreements. So the mechanisms look a little different depending on the agency. The high level differentiation between the two is that contracting agencies can be customers of the technology, and that granting agencies will never be the customers of the technology. So NSF will never buy the technology that is actually coming out of their investments. They're doing it for a public good. NIH is the same way. They may, in some instances, buy something if it's like laboratory equipment that's really innovative that will actually help them in their labs doing their intramural research. So actually NIH does offer a small subset of topics that they offer annually that are contracts and not grants. With that in mind, it also you also have some other agencies that do like grants at phase 1, but at phase 2 they do contracts. And some of the reason why they force small businesses or entrepreneurs into contracting, which is more burdensome, you're on the hook for more. You, like with a grant, it's a final report, and it can also be late, right? Like maybe you report on iEdison, your technology inventions, maybe you don't. With contracts, you have a lot more of a hook. You can withhold final payment until everything gets in. You know, you can obviously do fraud, waste, and abuse on both types, but for us at NASA, one of the primary reasons historically that we've done contracts is because we may be a customer for the technology that's being developed. Okay, so there's pros and cons to a 37-year-old program. Pro is there's some predictability that the funding will be available, and that's good for small businesses and entrepreneurs to know they have a place to go predictably every year, especially when markets go like this and venture capital may be or may not be available at different times in history, right? In fact, we tend to get a lot more applications when the market's not doing so good, right? Because they're coming to the government for money. The negative of having a 37-year-old program is that it tends to, and I lovingly call the SBIR program this, but we are a 37-year-old onion. So every year we grow another layer of requirements that takes us away from the core functionality of what it is that we're trying to deliver as a program. And those requirements come from a lot of different places. They come from GAO and IG recommendations. They come from when the law is reauthorized, there's always more Christmas ornaments added to it, which are new requirements for things we have to do. They come from new additional and more expansive reporting requirements that are required of the program over time. They come from a variety of different places. Every year the program has kind of gotten more complex. And so when I started 3.5 years ago, we embarked upon an effort to get back to understanding what the core focus of our program was and trying to unpeel some of those additional layers that may no longer be necessary or relevant in order to achieve our core purpose as a program. And another way of saying that is instead of letting process drive our strategy, we wanted strategy to drive our process. But in order to do that, we actually had to develop a strategy and make sure that we had enough organizational support within our agency that we could make some changes that would survive potential stakeholder pushback. Because when you have a 37-year-old program, you have a lot of stakeholders that feel like they have ownership and a say in a program, and you can't make everybody happy if you're trying to change things. Another way that I describe it is it's like we're a complex web that has been paralyzed into place, because if you try to move one strand, someone else gets displaced or something gets moved. And if you don't think about how you address the things that get moved downstream, you're paralyzed into place. And so we started to think about how we actually strategically begin to remove some strands, anticipating what we would be disturbing, but in a way where we actually had a rationale for it to show the broader impact that we were hoping to have through making some of those changes. So starting in 2016, we were really focused on trying to do two things that were more organizationally transformative. First, better aligning our program within NASA, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And second, redefining the way that we think about our customers. For years, our customers were our stakeholders, when in fact, in my view, the people we serve are the problem seekers and the problem solvers. We're the connector between those two groups. And those might not be stakeholders at all, the people that we're actually connecting. Now, small businesses, yes, they are. And they somewhat organize and have advocacy that they bring to congressional and to other NASA folks. But for a lot of years, we catered mostly to the problem seekers, to the people within NASA that were seeking to solve a particular problem, with not real, and looking at our problem solvers as being contractors. So they should do what we say, not innovators that are part of our nation's ability to be competitive and develop new technological capabilities for the future that NASA might be one customer of, right? But they're not, SBIR is different in that it's not truly just a contracting program where these are our contractors. Yeah. They are actually a customer. Small businesses and entrepreneurs are a customer that we are trying to recruit to participate in the program and reduce the friction and the pain in participating in our program. That was a total sea change in the way that we looked at that user group. We normally didn't ask those people what they wanted at all. You know, it was, if you want government funding, you're going to do what we say. So in order to kind of move towards this more customer-centric, as Jeff mentioned, culture, we did three things. We did a lot more than this, but for the paper, we highlighted three sets of things that we did to try to move our organization to a place where we could be more responsive to our customers and also engage them in a more complete way. So we were bringing the kind of culture change and the vision change for our program. We were bringing all of those people together we were bringing them along the way together. You had a question?
I was just going to ask, that does strike me as kind of a watershed change, and I wonder whether or not many grant recipients see the kind of the federal grant issuer as someone who says jump, and the grant recipient asks how high. Where did that kind of initially come from? Was that something that was kind of the vision of NASA leadership, or feedback from a few grant recipients? Where did this change kind of first motivate?
I think that there's two, so for people that are watching or listening online, where's their camera? Oh yeah, hi. For people that are online, the question was, what motivated the sea change, or the change in view that small businesses were actually customers? I think for me it was two things. One, while I was at OSTP, I had the opportunity of getting exposure to a lot of other federal agencies. That's one of the beauty of being in those interagency jobs. You see what a lot of other people are doing. Kind of the darling of OSTP at the time in the SBIR world was NSF, because NSF was basically at year 5 in what has now been a 10-year transformation to pivot their whole SBIR program to be much more entrepreneur focused. And so basically what they did is they said, we want to be like the pre-seed fund for entrepreneurs. We want to focus on growth companies, on de-risking technology and market risk before you even get venture capital investors or angel investors. They wanted to be the first investment in kind of growing the overall portfolio of small businesses and entrepreneurs within the country, giving more people the access to capital earlier. So they reorganized their entire program. They focused specifically on making it easier for the entrepreneur to access capital to grow more companies within the country. And we had a lot of conversations at OSTP at that time about how like none of the other federal agencies were thinking about SBIR that way. So I happened, when I returned to NASA, get the SBIR job. I didn't know what I was going back to when I left to go on detail. And I ended up back in the SBIR job at NASA, coming with some of these views of, A, how do we think about really our program as a seed fund and not just a set of niche contracts? When we think about $200 million, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in the aggregate. And the total amount of, if you look at the second factor too, is the changing nature of the space industry. The space industry for a long time had been the large primes serving NASA. And there's, small businesses playing that were seeking to become like suppliers, or like they'll build the particular component of a system that gets integrated by the primes that's all serving NASA. But the space industry has fundamentally changed over the last 10 years. There's new players, there's new markets, there's more commercial activity than there's ever been. And so it was a time to take a look from a space industry standpoint at NASA's program to see if our $200 million was being used in the best way that it could have been. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was totally used in the right way. NASA was the purchaser of everything. There were really no other customers than NASA. And NASA still is one of the main, like the biggest player in town when it comes to buying space technology. But we're not the only one anymore. And there's a share of those things that are going through other channels. And so it was time to look at whether or not our $200 million was actually being spent in a modern way for impact, given those two changes. I would also say another profoundly inspirational thing that happened to me personally while I was at OSTP is I was at OSTP when USDS and 18F were coming to be, which are kind of the internal to government consulting groups on how do we rethink digital services and how do we put a focus on the user, as opposed to just building huge enterprise systems that are unusable by anybody, right? Because you don't focus on the user. And so Agile was, coming to the forefront. Usability was coming to the forefront. And I was in the technology and innovation division, not in the CTO division or 18F or USDS, but I was close enough to those folks to kind of learn a little bit by osmosis what they were doing that was different on the software side and having this very user focus. And so I was inspired by the focus on the user. And this is also something not new to me. I've always been passionate about design thinking. I started the first design thinking meetup here in DC back in like 2010. That's now got like 3,000 members and it's being run by a whole different group of people. But design thinking is a way to use empathy-driven research to focus on users and help to develop better products and services is something I've always been really interested in because I believe in the power of people and their views. So this was just a way to kind of like channel that towards software that I was like, that's interesting. So you'll see throughout this presentation too that also fundamentally influenced the way that I looked at the technology tools that we made available to our small businesses for how they actually interacted with our program. What the application process was like for them, what the contract management process was like through them, because since we deal with so many companies, they primarily interact with us through technology a lot of the time, and sometimes interact with us through their actual conversations with their NASA points of contact, or like meeting us at a conference, but that technology interface has to be one that's inviting, easy, low barriers to entry, intuitive to use, in order to not just have the same old people that are always playing in this program play because it's like an insider's game to know how to navigate the technology or the system. So that's really the third bullet on this slide is when we look at what we were trying to do between 2016 and 2018 in order to make ourselves more friendly to businesses, there was a technology element to this, and that was through modernizing our electronic handbook. I will say that my team had the foresight to know that we needed to modernize that handbook well before I ever started. So they started planning this technology modernization back in 2014, maybe? I didn't start till 2016. So they had gone through the whole process, and also keep in mind, like, these kind of additional practices coming into government for more like user-centered approaches for software, enterprise software development was still in its nascent stages when we were actually developing the contract and designing the project. So we were the definition of building the plane as we were flying it, which is to be expected because it was all early stage. Kind of, it was a very formative. It was a time for a lot of change in the way software is done in the government at the time that we were actually formulating our project. So I came in certainly when the plane was already flying, and then I was like, "Ooh, I want a different wing," and so the team loved that. But we worked through it together, and we'll talk a little bit more about the results of that. But that was a critical part. If you're rebuilding the technology interface, and that's the primary way that your users interact with you, like you got to make sure you do that right? So it was super timely that was happening at the same time that we were focusing on the first two pieces, which were around making sure that our stakeholders and our users had a voice in program direction. I'll talk about some ways that we did that. And then making sure that we weren't like inaccessible in a black box as NASA, which is kind of how we had been. It was really, really hard for companies to get in touch with anybody. And so how do you actually open up the two-way communication channels more routinely between companies and the agencies so that there can be more of a natural exchange, because you're not getting the trust, the great interaction, and the flow of innovative ideas if you don't have mechanisms to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that we did in each of these three tranches, but they were all towards the goal of having our program be more business friendly. We did two things primarily around trying to incorporate user and stakeholder voices and values in our strategic planning. We actually went through a huge internal exercise to develop a program vision, mission, goals, and objectives that truly considered internal voices in the way that we formulated that. And so I'll come back to talk about number two, but one of the, and I don't have the objectives on this slide, but I'll just talk a little bit about it. So the SBIR program has so many masters. We have Congress, that's our master. We have SBA, the Small Business Administration, that's also our master, that sets all the policy for the program. We have highest level of NASA, and then we have space technology in NASA, where actually NASA is a bit unique in that all of the SBIR budget is consolidated in one organization. So I actually sit over the whole budget of NASA's SBIR program. Some other agencies, the budget is spent by the entities that actually have the R&D money. So it's just like a tax or a set aside within their own program budgets. So there's no single person that has control over that whole budget line. That makes it very different, actually. Your ability to strategize and consolidate that strategy if you don't control the budget is really, really hard at some of the other agencies that have SBIR programs. So one of the advantages we had going into even trying to do this was that we already had our budget consolidated. I have the whole budget line for SBIR. There was perception that we didn't actually control that budget because everybody else in the agency wanted to control parts of that budget. So there was a lot of resistance to us trying to do anything different than the status quo, than the norm. But us actually having physical control of the budget, in truth, made it a lot easier for us to, over time, exercise a little bit more strategic control over the program than some other agencies currently have. Like DOE's is spread all over, NIH's is spread all over. So it's a little bit difficult to have like a centralized view there. But within these goals, so we have 4 program goals that we developed through this collaborative process. The first goal is really about what problems are we seeking to solve. The second goal is really about who are we engaging to solve those problems. The third goal is around how well are we transitioning those technologies into actual use or commercialization. And the fourth goal is, are we doing it in an efficient and innovative way? Like, are we reinventing ourselves? And so, but each of these goals has competing objectives within them. So, for example, on goal 1 or goal 2, when we say engage a diverse portfolio of small businesses and entrepreneurs, there are plenty of people at NASA that like working with reliable small business contractors to solve a particular problem that they have. And so if you only work with reliable companies, you're only going to work with the companies you've seen before. So it's the same people that are going to be coming to you over and over and over again. That's important to get small business innovation from people we know we can trust, that know how to work in a space environment, which is non-trivially difficult. But it isn't really serving the purpose of creating the next generation of space entrepreneurs and the next generation of small businesses that might be trying to get their first award or their leg in the door, and might have a little bit less well-written proposal, because this isn't the 100th time they've done it, but have a high potential company and a high potential technology, maybe just aren't as good at the contract proposal process. And so maybe their score is a little less, right? Or maybe they're a little less known by the reviewers, and so they're not as high priority. Both of those groups are really important from a program level for us to be working with, though, due to the dual nature of our program. Not just doing research and development that meets NASA's needs, but also being a seed fund for economic growth and technology development for the space industry. And those are two very different groups, small businesses and entrepreneurs. And again, there's a pie, right? We only have so many awards we can make. There's $200 million we spend a year. If we spend more of that money on entrepreneurial types, we're going to spend less of that money on standard small business. So, and there are constituencies for both of those groups, so they're fighting each other. That's what I mean about competing objectives within each of these goals. So each of these goals has the traditional R&D small business angle on the goal, and a emerging space industry entrepreneurial view on the goal. And everybody could have a case that they're right, that their take of the program is the right one, because they can point to some language in the law or some language at SBA or some language at NASA that justifies their position. But it's not about their position being the 100% solution. It's their position having a share of a portfolio approach, where other positions can also have a share of the portfolio approach, and exposing those differences in opinion transparently so all can see that it is about a balance. I'm not saying that your interests are not important. What I'm saying is there's a lot of other interests too. And there's other goals that we're trying to meet through the program as well. So part of the reason that we did this collaborative strategic planning process out in the open and have intentionally set goals that show the tensions is so that people can't manipulate the program for their particular myopic purpose as easily anymore, because those tensions are out in the open. And it allows us to then try to more intentionally plan about portfolio balance. Then the challenge for us is, how do we know how much we should spend in each of the segments? The ideal is based on impact, but sometimes it takes 7 years to measure impact in R&D and small business commercialization. That's not something that happens overnight. So decisions we make today, we might not realize the impact of for 7 years. So it's hard to actually tie some of these decisions in real time to impact, but that's something I'm particularly personally very interested in, how we might do that more frequently than 7 years with proxy measures, those kinds of things. Jeff, you had another question?
I'm curious, because it sounds like you're saying we're trying to balance, we've got a variety of pressures. Mm-hmm. I think a little bit about the kind of the venture capital model of capital allocation. Venture capital firm may have more than 200 million, maybe a small one would have less. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that what they'll eventually do is they start out using their judgment. I think we should put this much into consumer products, this much into technology, this much into manufacturing in our investments of our portfolio. But at the end of the day, what they're going to do is they're going to come back and say, where are the great ideas and which are paying off? And you know what? If technology is giving us a 200% return on investment and manufacturing is giving us a 5% return, we're either going to zero out or really minimize the investment in a portfolio that's not providing the return towards our mission. And in that case, it's their capital appreciation. So I'm curious about whether or not, as part of your kind of program setting and prioritization process, those kind of after the fact, here was the return, here was the impact on our mission, here was the innovation that resulted, and therefore, you know what, we like the people who say small businesses are good, but the entrepreneurs have been hitting all the home runs. Let's make the small business funding much smaller and the entrepreneur funding much bigger, even if there are a bunch of advocates for the small business funding.
Mm-hmm. So there's 8 different ways I could answer that question. So it's a good one, complex one. Let me start by saying that a challenge at NASA that makes us different from DoD is that we do not have funding for industrial-based support at NASA. And it's important to us that small businesses still exist when we need them, just as much as it is for DoD, especially for specialty component parts that are really difficult to make. And so one way that SBIR ends up getting used as a result is industrial-based support for small businesses that are iterating upon their capabilities by using research and development as a way to make their stuff more capable, but they actually need this funding annually or they go under, right? So there is one part, and DoD actually has industrial-based funding where they can just continue to support key suppliers from a national security standpoint. We don't have that. So that's maybe not the way that I would ideally like to see our program used, but there's no other source for that kind of thing at the agency. And so there will always be a certain amount of that ends up happening in our program, whether it's by design or not by design, because people will find the way to find the money that they need to stay alive. The other thing that I will say to answer your question though is that, so yes, VCs take a portfolio approach, but that's completely driven by their financial model. VCs are trying to make at least a 5x return. They'll say things like 10x return, but like even the good ones are making like 3 or 4 now. There's rarely ones that are making like 10x returns. And like, I think something like 70% of micro VCs don't even return the capital of their investment right now. So there's vastly different performance of VCs that are out there, what they're actually performing. And when they make their first investment, whenever they're making an investment against their investment thesis, any investment they make, they believe could be $1 billion company. Because they need one of the 10 investments that they make to actually be $1 billion company to make the 3 to 4x return that they promise their investors. But they know they're gonna have 90% failure. They know that 90% of their investments, or probably 80% of their investments, aren't gonna make any money back. And maybe 10% of their investments undergo a merger or acquisition that maybe return 200 million, 300 million. But the one that drives their fund performance is the one that IPOs at $1 billion or goes through a merger or acquisition at $1 billion. And so when they're making decisions about, so their metrics are purely economic. Purely economic. SBIR is not purely economic. Like we have other goals for the country, and we're pre-VC, we're pre-angel. VCs are investing in things where the technical risk has already been reduced substantially enough that they feel like they can just handle the market risk. And SBIR often ends up playing a role of reducing the technical risk before things ever show up to angel and venture capital investors. So if their like ultimate performance is based on economics, and then they make decisions about whether or not they're going to move investments along in the portfolio based on what they think is going to be worth $1 billion, their major metric is traction. Like how much traction do they see this company having? How much, like it's not just revenues, it's do they think that this could reach the revenues based on the traction we're seeing in new customer acquisition, their sales pipeline, whatever it is. And they're using those numbers to determine, do I make the second investment? Do I get involved in the Series A, the Series B, the Series C? Do I keep doubling down on them and keep investing in them? And for us, we have series of investments too. We have a phase 1, we have a phase 2, and we have some post-phase 2 stuff, but our metrics are different from traction. Our metrics by law are given to us. We have to look at science and scientific and technical merit, the work plan, and the team, and then commercial potential. And that is the most difficult, commercial potential is the most difficult for the government to assess. That is not what we were in the profession of doing. NASA is really good at evaluating scientific and technical merit of an idea, but commercial potential, whether or not there's a business there, like we might think we know what we're doing, we don't know what we're doing. There's a whole class of people that do that for a living and make a lot of money off of it, and that's investors, right? So the metrics are different. Like agree that it's about a portfolio approach in both instances though, is that you have to be willing to take on risk in both portfolios, in both types of investments, both VC and angel and in government. You have to have a tolerance for and an acceptance of risk. And for us, it's acceptance of both market risk and technical risk. Like we don't know if the technology project's actually gonna work, right? We should be taking on risky ideas. Like we're the only people that would pay for that. in the country. But because our program ends up sometimes being used as a way to like support a particular company's widget still existing on the market, those tend to be low risk investments, low technical risk investments. So we have to make sure that from a portfolio approach, we're ensuring that we're taking on an acceptable amount of risk. And that's high for SBIR. We want it to be high. It should be higher than pretty much any other research and development program in the government because you're focused on small business research. Okay, so the other thing that we did in order to develop our strategy, in addition to listening to our internal stakeholders that obviously have very different ways they're trying to use this money and solve their problems and augment their budgets and all sorts of different things, we also made a concerted effort to listen to the small businesses and entrepreneurs that both were participating in our program but weren't. And maybe they weren't because they didn't know about us, but maybe they weren't because they had an impression about us, or maybe they weren't because it was difficult to actually interact with us in practice. And so we went through a customer discovery exercise with 18F back in 2016 to talk to our small business customers. And this is not meant to read, but we have it, it's an eye chart in the way that it's presented here. But basically the top thread is the emotional journey of a typical small business going through the SBIR process from beginning to end. Beginning meaning not even being aware that it's out there. So lots of highs and lows, a lot of the stuff at the top is quotes from companies that are illustrative of the experience that they have kind of going through it from beginning to end. And then the stuff at the bottom is the ways in which those customers actually interact with us, front of house, back of house, through technology, through people, in understanding kind of where we could improve those touch points, right? The ways in which government, or the ways in which companies actually interact with us. So this was us hearing from them about their challenges, not us pretending that we understand what it's like to be in their shoes. Yeah.
You, I'm sure, realize that's kind of groundbreaking. And I didn't tell you, but you can ask questions to the audience too. And maybe on your behalf, I'm curious, do folks who work with other grant-making agencies, have any of your agencies tried to kind of map out the customer life cycle experience, even setting aside the emotional part of it, but has anyone really gone through a customer-centric analysis of their grant recipients? I'm seeing several shaking heads no. Which leads me to kind of confirm it. It seems like, and I'm
it's
curious.
Not, yeah, it's not
Has
common
anyone
because
else
the
done this
culture
that
is
you know?
if you want government money, go through our process.
Yeah.
It's not, are we making the process to get this money, which there's a purpose behind, like the government is offering it for some reason, right, to have an impact.
Yeah.
Like, are we actually able, is the process that we're offering it through helping us to achieve that impact or not? And you can discover a lot by talking to the people that go through the process. It's scary because you get a lot of negatives. You get a lot of things you don't want to hear, get a lot of things you're like, yeah, I'd love to be able to do that, but that's really hard. And then it's prioritizing, well, which of these things are the greatest pain points? What things do we actually think we could address and have some investment to take on, and really prioritizing themselves in a way and doing it with humility, like not saying we've just always done it this way, so it's got to be this way, and not wanting to take any criticism, because it can feel like criticism, but it's not. We know it's not about us as people. It's about trying to just create a better government program and let them vent. It's fine. Like, we can be the punching bag a little bit, but ultimately at the end of the day, we want to create a better experience for everybody.
Do you know, even within NASA, again, you're focused on SBIR, is the main NASA grant-making capacity paying attention to customer experience?
We tend to be a little bit of a groundbreaker.
You're an entrepreneur.
At NASA and things. We are. We're entrepreneurial at NASA. Or we try to be at SBIR. We try to be kind of pushing assumptions on kind of what the process should be, and sometimes we end up solving agency problems through doing that. So because we're at every mission directorate, at every center, we, in order to do some of the innovative things that we want to do, we sometimes have to ask the question first and figure out how to solve it, and then other people could benefit from that at the agency. Some do, some don't.
And this
Question
is
at the back?
Sorry.
So when you started building the roadmap, basically, what kind of feedback were you getting from internal process? I mean, I saw that your built-in processes and tools. And so how did the internal stakeholders feel about the customer journey map?
Yeah,
did that-
so that's a great question. What I really want to do, I hope to be able to do this moving forward, is actually we only did an external customer journey map with our problem solvers. I would love to do one with our problem seekers on the inside, right? We talk to our inside people all the time though. So our inside people have no problem telling you what they want and criticizing things. They have no problem. The small businesses, actually, it's harder to elicit real feedback from them because they don't want to feel like they might not get an award based on what they told you. And so it's actually harder to get the small businesses to be honest with you. But that kind of crosswalk between the two is something that I would like to do actually at some point when we're not sprinting towards the most urgent issues of the year. It's a more strategic item that I would like to do. But we didn't actually share the customer journey map with the external folks that broadly with the internal folks. But I think that that is an excellent idea because when you actually do have the more authentic conversation to let the folks inside know how hard it is for the folks outside, empathy is gathered. And it makes them perhaps more willing to do something that's a little harder for them because they know it's a lot easier for the person on the outside, right? And if being a parent, that's a really good point.
I think, just tying it back to the agency mission
Oh yeah,
would help drive
Yeah.
some of the internal focus folks.
Yeah.
Here were your pain points with the process, and by
yeah.
solving those pain points, we're driving the mission forward.
And one of the things that we started to do this year actually is a road show to all of the centers where we have worked very, very hard to consolidate our messaging around the competing goals of the program, the multiple purposes of our program, give people a bigger picture, not just you buried at the center are seeing a call come out for like problem statements and you're like, well, I need this widget, so I'm just going to use the program to do this. And you're one of 3,500 reviewers at the agency and you don't really get how you fit within the broader purpose of the agency or the broader purpose of the program. And so now that we feel like we have our messages a lot tighter and a lot more validated from a variety of different sources, we're actually starting to go off and road showing that with much more of we started with alignment at headquarters, because if I didn't have alignment all the way up to the administrator of NASA, there's no way we could have made some of the changes that we've made, because in the past, years ago, it was if a particular part of the agency was upset that we wanted to standardize a process and they didn't like the standard process, they would run to my predecessor's bosses and say, we don't like that. And since SBIR wasn't terribly aligned with the agency and people just thought it was a tax, we're just giving money to small businesses, just make your awards. We don't really, we care about the impact, but just make your awards, that's what you need to do. It was very difficult to make any change because they just say, yeah, okay, we don't want to anger you over this thing, so we'll just tell our own people to stop doing the thing that they were doing. And that there has been a realignment of leadership within space technology all the way up to the top that is supportive of using this money and this program in a higher impact way in a evolving space industry. And so they're willing to take some complaints, and just say, yeah, I get that that's painful for you, but it's for a broader purpose. And so I had to spend most of my time initially making sure that we had alignment up, and then started going the levels down. But doing that iterative, the strategy development process started, everybody at the agency that worked on SBIR could have a voice in that strategy development. And that was happening during the vertical alignment process up. So it's not like we waited until that to talk to everybody. It was iterative and it was kind of happening at the same time, but it's now going out with the full court press, is when we're sure we have the support, right? And going out to all of the centers and kind of spreading this message more broadly. I know that we're almost at time, so I just want to get through these last things at a high level. In trying to create more routine opportunities for engagement between the people within NASA, the problem seekers and the problem solvers, we also added an annual industry event opportunity for connections for people to actually come together in person. I think one of the more innovative also technology and interaction point offerings that we've made is that at the close of our solicitation, because culturally NASA right now won't do a pre-solicitation. People don't want to answer questions before a solicitation is finalized. They don't have time to do it. So the way in which we were able to allow companies to have input and get feedback back into our process was as soon as the solicitation closes, we basically open up an RFI where companies can come in and comment on the previous subtopic content and say what was unclear about it, what maybe it should have been expanded to include in order to allow for more innovation, whatever it might be. And that's integrated within our electronic handbook so that when the solicitation is being formulated for the upcoming year, the people writing that same subtopic for the upcoming year automatically get that feedback. It's kind of like automated market research that they get without having to do anything themselves. It's just we open an RFI and then that feedback is automatically given to the formulators of the subtopics the next time around. So we've kind of automated a market research portion of old subtopics. That does not solve the issue, though, of better communication between the NASA, the problem seekers and the problem solvers, but it is a first step. And a lot of what we've had to do is take the first step in these culture change activities. And we got a lot of response in the first couple times we did it. More of the data is in the paper. So the last thing that we did, which is where the EHB was the primary tool of modernization, was around updating our technology system that is an end-to-end. So we have an end-to-end capability where we do our solicitation development, so all the subtopic development, that then becomes a solicitation where companies propose through a submissions module, where then those things transform over to a review and selection module where we actually use it with our internal community to review those, prioritize them and rank them for selection, and then transferring over the relevant content for contract negotiation so that the contracts get negotiated, and then over to contract management where all of the deliverables are submitted, where all the final reports go. And so we have an end-to-end technology system. And a lot of times with agencies, they use like grants.gov for submission, they'll use like internal SharePoint sites for review and selection, they'll use some other, whatever their procurement people are using for contract management and contract negotiation. So data can be a nightmare because the points in time when all those things are happening in different systems. It becomes difficult to manage process efficiency performance through those kinds of things, or have transparency across different people's roles in the process. And so this has been probably a 20-year process. REI would know better. 20-year process to get us to the point where we are end-to-end, where we truly are end-to-end. And but the system had been started to be built back in the early 2000s, and it was very clear in like 2014 that it needed to be modernized. We were building in a code. What was the code it was in? I don't even know the name of it, but like we couldn't hire people to like actually update it. We wanted to actually get a more modern infrastructure. We wanted to update our security protocols. So there were things that we just needed to do to stop band-aiding, keeping that system alive, in order to help have it support us for the next however many years. But one of the also things that we did here that is very unique is that we prioritize user experience in this. It wasn't just taking our processes and institutionalizing those through a step-by-step process that we in the program thought was the way that the business process should flow. It was trying to make sure that our actual users of those modules had a voice in how not only the UX and the UI, but actually the business processes themselves and the policy questions that emerged about why do we have to do things this way versus this way. And so we actually created a series of user steering committees that we're still deeply in now. We just finished a user steering committee on contracts, on the contracts management process, where we're actually bringing together user steering groups where they're going through and criticizing the system, identifying where the bottlenecks are, where the difficulties in usability are, where the process inefficiencies are, and then we're asking them to prioritize what we should fix. And then that's brought forward to the program office in a level 1 where we decide how much budget we have to do whatever their requests were, but this is them telling us what should be fixed, not us hypothesizing what our users think should be done. And so that has been also illuminating from, it might be a pet peeve of mine, but it's not a pet peeve of the majority of the users, so then maybe my pet peeve doesn't get addressed, and theirs does, right? And that's also like a shift in, and sometimes the team has to remind me that, Jen, you're the only one that thinks this is a problem. Okay, all right, we don't need to fix it. But this has been also something that was, that we worked collaboratively between the government and REI to figure out how to do, and we're still iterating on how to do it sustainably for the long term. Because a modular-based user steering group approach ongoing is too expensive and too difficult to continually do, but we're inventing together how to actually create ongoing usability for an enterprise system, which is exciting within our particular program that has a lot of business process. So I think I've already talked about a lot of these lessons learned in the course of the presentation, but it was a sea change to actually become more customer focused, and engaging those people can be challenging, but it's not impossible. And people that don't want to do it will tell you there's things like the PRA and FACA, and there's fairness in talking to your potential proposers with procurement. You're always in a blackout, whatever. There are pieces of truth to each of those comments, but there are also ways to navigate through those in an appropriate and fair way that actually you have your legal's approval of and your procurement office's approval of. It's not straightforward or common, but it's possible. And so when people tell you you can't do that, they're wrong. You can. It's just non-trivial to figure it out the first time. But then after that, it's actually not that difficult. And then where to next? What are we actually working on as we move forward? A big piece of focus is how we better leverage all the data. We have 2 decades of data. How we better leverage the data that we have, not just for managing or measuring the outcomes of the program overall from a research and development standpoint, but also from a process standpoint, from a process management and a process efficiency standpoint. Using more analytics on the vast amounts of data that we have that frankly no human can comprehend. We make 600 awards a year. And the way that those are connected to previous awards and how those are connected to other awards at the agency are incredibly complicated, but things we want to start to be able to put our hands around. We actually redesigned our entire organization at the program management level to manage for this customer-centered, kind of business process focused way of thinking. And so we went through a whole organizational redesign process where we were aligning our organization's accountability with the actual outcomes that we want to see for the program. And we're in the first 6 months of that reorg, and it's already going really well. It's really, really nice to see people be in charge of a work stream where they feel accountability over it, they understand how they align to the vision, and they have a sense of the metrics for performance that will be used to gauge their success, and then just allowing them to crank like in a really innovative way as small teams. So some places are going better than others, but as a whole, it's way better organizationally aligned than we were like 2 years ago. And we continue to try to push our thinking on how we can be even better. We use our annual program meeting to bring in training. Last year we brought in the NESTA folks that I was talking about, the kind of evidence-based policy making. How do we do experiments in the way that we communicate with various small businesses and understand what works and what doesn't, and like an A/B testing, simple A/B testing environment, simple experiments we can run since it's a 7-year time frame to actually understand real impact. This year we brought in a design thinking trainer to help people think about how they can get the tools to be more user-centered themselves in the work that they're doing every day. And we continue to enhance the program's technology to make it more capable and more modern to help us have the ultimate impact that we want to have. So we focused on, people say people, process, and technology a lot. We actually did focus on all of those things, and that they're all critically linked in order to make sure that we're accomplishing our goals. We have a lot of work to do on streamlining process, but I really think that you have to do a piece of all of those things together in order to have a chance for sustainable transformational change. Otherwise, it's easier to unwind technology or process alone, or if it's just one person you're relying on, that also doesn't have much sustainability. So we've invested in our people, hired some new people, shifted around some folks, reorganized in order to make sure that these changes actually get deeply ingrained within the culture of our program too. So it doesn't depend on any one person. All right, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming
Yeah.
over to GW campus. It was great. Thank you very much. And I know it was great. We allowed questions throughout, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
May we offer, if folks didn't have a chance to ask the questions, can they reach
Yeah, I
out
can
to
stick
you?
around. I can also stick around for another like 20 minutes or so. I know I've got to talk to Samantha too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
May I ask-
Thank
It was
you,
great.
and I will follow up with the
Thank you. I got
IGL
nothing.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
May I ask you, you know, I think you receive a sort of customer journey is unusual.
They want,
in
how many
government,
people
especially
on that?
Do you think it would be useful,
At one
for
point there were
example,
22,
for
they
HUD
kind of filtered it out, like,
for
Sure.
housing authorities or
Probably
for
going to
HRSA making a grant to health plans? Would it be useful to them?
Probably going to be
Customer
I mean, I think it's always useful to understand if like the assumptions that you're making on what's a reasonable